June 14, 1986. A quiet cornfield outside Bensonville, just west of Chicago. The ground had already been disturbed. Two men stood in the tall grass, shovels biting into wet soil. They weren't farmers. They weren't construction workers. They were looking for something buried. Hours earlier, a phone call had tipped off the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Two brothers were missing. One of them was the most feared enforcer the Chicago outfit had ever produced. His name was Anthony Spilotro. The agents already suspected the truth before the first shovel hit bone. Because in the world of the Chicago outfit, men like Spilotro didn't simply disappear. They were erased. The bodies were found hours later, beaten beyond recognition, buried in a shallow grave beside a suburban cornfield. It looked like a revenge killing, a mob war, a violent collapse of power. But the truth was colder, because Anthony Spilotro wasn't killed by enemies. He was killed by the very organization he had served for 20 years. And the real reason had almost nothing to do with what the movie Casino would later claim. It was about control, about humiliation, and about a mistake no outfit soldier was allowed to make. Long before the cornfield outside Bensonville, Anthony Spilotro was just another boy growing up in the working-class neighborhoods of Chicago. He was born on May 19, 1938, the fourth of 6 sons in an Italian immigrant family. His parents ran a small restaurant on the west side. It was the kind of place where neighborhood men gathered late at night. Cigarette smoke hung in the air. Cash changed hands quietly. Deals were spoken in lowered voices. Young Anthony listened. The streets around him were already shaped by the power of the Chicago outfit. Protection rackets, gambling houses, loan sharks operating behind storefronts. In those neighborhoods, crime wasn't hidden. It was structured. Spilotro was small for his age. Short, compact, but intensely aggressive. School records and police files later described him the same way. Quick to anger, willing to fight, and unusually comfortable with violence. By his late teens, he was already working as a muscle for local bookmakers. Debt collectors noticed him first. Then the outfit noticed him. What separated Spilotro from other street enforcers was simple. He didn't hesitate. Witnesses from later investigations described the same pattern again and again. When violence was required, Spilotro volunteered. By the early 1960s, he was operating under the protection of rising outfit figures connected to Joseph Iappa and the old guard leadership that still controlled Chicago's underworld economy. But Anthony was never alone. His younger brother Michael Spilotro followed him everywhere. Michael lacked Anthony's brutality. He was quieter, less feared. But loyalty mattered more than reputation inside the outfit. The brothers became a pair. One violent, one obedient. Together they moved deeper into Chicago's criminal hierarchy during the 1960s, a decade when the outfit was quietly expanding far beyond the city. Las Vegas, union pension funds, casino skimming operations worth millions. And within that expanding empire, the outfit needed something very specific. Not diplomats, not politicians. They needed a man who could enforce silence. Anthony Spilotro was exactly that kind of man. By the early 1970s, the Chicago outfit had decided to send him somewhere far more important than the streets of Chicago. They were sending him to Las Vegas. And that decision would eventually lead back to a shallow grave in a Midwestern cornfield. By the early 1970s, the power structure of the Chicago outfit had expanded far beyond the streets of Chicago. The real money was no longer in neighborhood gambling dens. It was in casinos, specifically in the rapidly growing gambling capital of Las Vegas. Behind the flashing lights and luxury resorts, millions of dollars were being quietly siphoned out of casino counting rooms before profits were officially recorded. This operation was known simply as the skim. The money flowed back to Chicago through layers of couriers and shell businesses, but a system that large required control. Someone had to intimidate competitors, silence thieves, and keep the operation disciplined. That job went to Anthony Spilotro. Officially, he ran a gift shop called the Gold Rush Limited. In reality, he served as the outfit's primary enforcer in Las Vegas. His assignment was simple: protect the skim. At first, Spilotro operated quietly, but his reputation for violence followed him west. Soon he assembled a group of professional burglars and thieves that federal investigators would later call the hole-in-the-wall gang. Their method was precise. Instead of breaking through doors, they drilled through walls and ceilings to enter jewelry stores, electronic shops, and high-end boutiques across Las Vegas. The robberies were fast, clean, highly organized, but they were also reckless. For the leadership of the Chicago outfit, Las Vegas was supposed to be discreet. The scheme depended on politicians, casino executives, and regulators looking the other way. Public crime threatened that balance. And Spilotro had another problem. He enjoyed attention. His temper, his brutality, and his constant presence in police reports began attracting the wrong kind of scrutiny from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Even worse, Las Vegas law enforcement began linking him directly to organized crime activity. Inside Chicago, bosses like Joseph Iappa were hearing complaints. Too many robberies, too many headlines, too many questions. The man who had been sent to protect the outfit's most valuable operation was becoming something dangerous. A spotlight. And in the world of organized crime, visibility was a form of betrayal. Because the higher Anthony Spilotro rose inside the outfit's hierarchy, the more powerful he appeared. But power inside the Mafia had one rule. It only existed as long as the bosses allowed it. And by the late 1970s, patience in Chicago was starting to run out. The problem with Anthony Spilotro was not just violence. Violence was expected. The problem was exposure. By the late 1970s, the federal government had begun paying closer attention to the financial pipelines connecting Las Vegas casinos to the Chicago outfit. The scheme had worked for years because it remained invisible. Casino executives cooperated. Regulators avoided difficult questions. Politicians had little incentive to investigate. But Spilotro's behavior was changing that balance. His cruise burglaries were becoming impossible to ignore. Jewelry stores, electronics warehouses, high-end retail shops across Las Vegas began reporting the same unusual method of entry. Walls drilled open from adjacent buildings. Safes emptied within minutes. Police soon connected the crimes to Spilotro's circle. The press followed. Newspapers in Nevada started writing openly about Chicago mob influence in Las Vegas. For the outfit's leadership back in Chicago, those headlines were a warning sign. Because Las Vegas was not just another territory. It was a financial engine. And the more attention law enforcement paid to Spilotro, the closer investigators moved toward the real prize, the casino scheme itself. Meanwhile, Spilotro was losing control of his own crew. Members of the so-called hole-in-the-wall gang were being arrested. Under pressure, some began talking. Each interrogation brought federal agents closer to understanding how the outfit operated inside the city. But Spilotro did something even more dangerous. He started acting like a boss. He hosted lavish gatherings, traveled publicly with known criminals, and developed a highly visible personal life that police and reporters could easily track. Inside the Mafia hierarchy, that kind of behavior broke an unwritten rule. Enforcers were supposed to remain invisible. They carried out violence quietly, then disappeared into the background. Spilotro did the opposite. And the consequences were already beginning to form far beyond Nevada. Because in Washington, D.C., federal investigators and congressional committees had started asking a question that threatened the entire system. Who was really controlling Las Vegas? As the investigations expanded, one name appeared again and again in surveillance reports, police files, and informant testimony. Anthony Spilotro, the man sent to protect the outfit's most profitable secret, had become its most recognizable face. And recognition inside organized crime could be fatal. By the early 1980s, the investigation into mob influence in Las Vegas had moved far beyond local police. Federal prosecutors were building something much larger. For decades, the Chicago outfit had quietly skimmed millions of dollars from casino counting rooms. The process was simple. Before revenue was officially recorded, bundles of cash were removed and sent back to Chicago through trusted couriers. No taxes, no records, no oversight, but the system depended on silence from dozens of people. casino managers, accountants, couriers, and enforcers. Eventually, someone talked. Wiretaps, informants, financial records. The Federal Bureau of Investigation began assembling the pieces of what would later become one of the largest organized crime prosecutions in American history. The investigation focused on the outfit's leadership in Chicago, including powerful bosses such as Joseph Iappa and senior figures responsible for supervising the Vegas operations. But every investigation needs a visible link between the leadership and the crime. That link was Anthony Spilotro. His name appeared repeatedly in surveillance reports. Informants described his role as the outfit's enforcer in Las Vegas. Witnesses connected him to intimidation, threats, and the protection of casino skimming operations. Even worse for the outfit, Spilotro was becoming a public figure. Local television crews filmed him entering courtrooms. Reporters followed his movements. His presence in Las Vegas nightlife was impossible to ignore. The bosses in Chicago were watching carefully, because organized crime had always relied on a simple political principle: avoid provoking the federal government. The moment Washington began focusing on you, the risk multiplied. By 1983, that risk had become unavoidable. Federal prosecutors announced indictments tied to the casino skimming operation. Court cases exposed the financial pipeline between Las Vegas casinos and Chicago mob leadership. Every headline mentioned the same name: Anthony Spilotro. Inside the outfit's hierarchy, the calculation was becoming painfully clear. Spilotro had once been an asset, someone capable of protecting the organization's most valuable enterprise. Now he was something else: evidence. And in the Mafia's internal logic, evidence could not be allowed to survive indefinitely. The decision forming inside Chicago's leadership would not be made publicly. It would not be discussed openly. But by the mid-1980s, the organization had already begun preparing for the final solution to the Spilotro problem. By 1985, the atmosphere around Anthony Spilotro had changed. Not in Las Vegas. On the surface, his life looked the same. The same restaurants, the same associates, the same public appearances that had already drawn years of attention. But inside the hierarchy of the Chicago outfit, something critical had shifted: protection. For years, Spilotro operated under the authority of bosses in Chicago who valued his brutality. He had enforced their rules, collected their debts, protected the casino skimming pipeline that sent millions of dollars back to the Midwest. But power in organized crime is never permanent. It depends entirely on usefulness. And by the mid-1980s, Spilotro's usefulness was fading. Federal prosecutions tied to the Las Vegas skim had already damaged the outfit's leadership. Courtroom testimony exposed internal structures. Informants described how money flowed through the organization. Spilotro's name appeared repeatedly. Even worse, his personal behavior continued to violate Mafia discipline. He was loud, visible, confrontational with local law enforcement. And then there were the rumors. Inside mob circles, whispers spread that Spilotro had begun acting independently, that he had formed alliances without approval, that some of the profits from criminal operations in Las Vegas were no longer moving cleanly back to Chicago. Whether those accusations were true hardly mattered. In Mafia politics, perception can become a death sentence. At the same time, Spilotro's closest allies were disappearing. Members of the hole-in-the-wall gang were in prison or under investigation by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Others were quietly distancing themselves. Even his own brother, Michael Spilotro, had become more cautious. But loyalty inside the Mafia is not measured by friendship. It is measured by obedience. And somewhere inside the leadership circle of the Chicago outfit, a final decision was being shaped. Anthony Spilotro had become a liability. Liabilities could not remain inside the organization, which meant that sooner or later someone would invite him to a meeting. And in Mafia history, meetings like that rarely ended with a handshake. June 1986. By then, the decision had already been made inside the leadership circle of the Chicago outfit. Anthony Spilotro was no longer useful. He was dangerous. And dangerous men inside organized crime are not warned. They are removed. The message that reached Spilotro was simple. Come to Chicago. There would be a meeting, a promotion discussion, possibly even a formal recognition of his role within the organization. For a man who had spent years enforcing the outfit's rules, the invitation sounded like long-delayed validation. He did not come alone. His younger brother, Michael Spilotro, traveled with him. What they did not know was that the decision had already been approved by senior outfit leadership. The purpose of the meeting was never negotiation. It was elimination. The brothers were lured to a suburban home outside Chicago. Accounts from later federal investigations suggest several outfit members were waiting inside. The attack was immediate. There was no ceremony, no speech, no formal accusation. Both men were beaten severely. Witness testimony later described a coordinated assault meant to ensure neither brother survived. The brutality served a purpose. Inside Mafia culture, punishment carried symbolic meaning. Public violence reinforced discipline within the ranks. But the Spilotro killing also required secrecy. After the beating, the bodies were transported across state lines to farmland near Bensonville. There, in a shallow grave beneath loose soil, the two brothers were buried together. For days, no one outside the organization knew where they had gone. But investigators already suspected the truth, because the disappearance followed a pattern as old as the Mafia itself. When a soldier becomes too visible, when an enforcer attracts too much attention, when loyalty becomes uncertain, the organization restores control the only way it knows how, by erasing the problem. And on that June night in 1986, the Chicago outfit erased Anthony Spilotro. When Anthony Spilotro and his brother Michael Spilotro vanished in June 1986, investigators immediately suspected organized crime. Disappearances like that rarely had innocent explanations. Days later, the bodies were discovered in a shallow grave near Bensonville, just outside Chicago. The condition of the remains confirmed what federal agents already believed. This was an internal execution. For the Chicago outfit, the killing achieved its immediate objective. The most visible figure connecting Las Vegas crime to Chicago leadership was gone. But the damage had already been done. By the late 1980s, federal prosecutors had assembled massive cases targeting the outfit's financial operations. Investigations into casino skimming exposed how mob-controlled casinos secretly diverted millions of dollars before profits were officially recorded. Witness testimony, surveillance recordings, and financial records began revealing the structure of organized crime networks that had operated quietly for decades. In many ways, Spilotro's death came too late to protect the organization. Federal indictments continued. Prison sentences followed. And the once powerful pipeline between Las Vegas casinos and Chicago mob leadership began collapsing under federal pressure. Years later, Hollywood would dramatize the story in Casino, portraying Spilotro as a reckless gangster whose violence destroyed the operation. But the real story was more calculated. Spilotro did not simply self-destruct. He was removed, because the outfit believed eliminating him would slow the investigation and restore control. Instead, it revealed something much deeper about the internal logic of organized crime. The organization had sacrificed one of its most loyal soldiers to protect itself. And in doing so, it exposed the fragile system that had sustained mob power for generations. The grave outside Bensonville was never meant to tell a story. It was meant to end one. Inside the hierarchy of the Chicago outfit, loyalty was always presented as the highest virtue. Soldiers swore allegiance. Enforcers carried out orders. Silence protected the structure. But Anthony Spilotro's life revealed the hidden condition behind that loyalty. It only existed while the organization needed you. For nearly 2 decades, Anthony Spilotro had done exactly what the outfit required. He intimidated witnesses, enforced discipline, protected the flow of illicit money moving from Las Vegas back to Chicago's leadership. Violence had built his reputation. Violence had secured his authority. And violence eventually erased him. Because in organized crime, power is not measured by fear alone. It is measured by control. The moment an enforcer becomes more visible than the system he serves, the system reacts. Quietly, decisively. The cornfield where Spilotro was buried became a silent reminder of that rule. In the Mafia, the greatest danger is not your enemies. It is the organization that once trusted you. And the moment it decides you are no longer useful,